Hi everybody, welcome back to yet another screencast. Here is where I go over the Essay 1 assignment sheet with you. As I scroll down here, you can see it's pretty detailed. This is because I tend to make my assignment sheets into teaching moments, and this particular essay is really prescriptively structured. I know I gave you kind of a heads up that I was going to do this semester. Um, but I really want you to read this closely and listen to this closely, maybe a couple times, so you can understand what your task is. The essay here asks you to choose one of the two Angela Carter stories we're reading for right now, either The Company of Wolves or The Tiger's Bride, and then write an essay about it. And the prompt for the essay is actually pretty simple. Um, it's not easy, but it's short and it's straightforward. This is a research question, and the research question is this: in either Angela Carter's *The Company of Wolves* or *The Tiger's Bride*, how and to what extent does power related to traditional gender roles shift for the female protagonist, and what is the significance of that power shift? So that's it. If I didn't have to tell you all this other stuff, you could just approach that in an essay. However, I think all this other stuff is going to help you. So this section right here, this talks about how there needs to be headers, a thesis statement that's underlined, topic sentences that are underlined, and then everything else that an academic essay should have. So English 123 assumes that you've taken English 122 and you basically know how to structure an essay and you know the parts of an essay. Even if you're not amazing at it, you don't have to be amazing at it. English 123, one of the things that you do is you practice what you know and you work on it. So this is a step in that. All right, so let me unpack that research question for a minute. So the way that this essay is structured is it's building on your observations. You won't have done them yet, but you're going to do them soon, either for The Company of Wolves or The Tiger's Bride. And these observations are structured almost exactly like the one that you did for Red Riding Hood. It asks you to look at character traits for the female and then character traits for the male. So in The Company of Wolves, that's Little Red Riding Hood and the wolf. In The Company of Wolves, he's a shape-shifting wolf. He appears in the form of a hunter, and then he turns into kind of a werewolf creature. And there are some other side stories in there that are pretty cool too. In The Tiger's Bride, we have Beauty, because this is a retelling of Beauty and the Beast, and then Beast, who in this story is an actual tiger that walks on two legs, and he disguises himself as a human to try to fit in. So these are two of my favorite stories. I think they're so good. I'm asking you to read both of them so you can kind of discover which one kind of speaks to you and that you'd like to write about more. They're also both kind of structured in the same way. Okay, so it asks you to look at gender roles in those stories of the men and the women, or the men and the beasts, however you will. So the first question is how? How does power shift? Okay, so when you think about writing your essay, before you answer the question, how does power shift? That power shift is related to what happens in the story. That's related to the plot. So as the plot goes on and the story gets more and more complicated and interesting, things are going to happen related to power. That concept of power might sound strange, but if you remember back to the overview of traditional gender roles, we realize that in these stories, in the fairy tales, or based on traditional gender roles, the males, or the stand-in for the males, like the wolves, have more power in the story, based on a lot of different things, but essentially based on society, right? So I'm asking you to look at how that power balance changes, and then how much it changes. So those are the main things that you're looking at. You're going to be explaining that, and then near the end of your essay, you're going to talk about what's significant about that power shift. So when I scroll down in a second, what this outline um, is going to ask you to do, and I'm going to ask you to follow this outline very specifically. This outline tells you everything you need to do to build a case to make your argument. It doesn't tell you what to argue, but it tells you how to argue it. So the first thing that you'll be doing is introducing the story and writing a thesis statement. I'll talk more about that in a second. Then you'll explain how both the male and the female relate to traditional gender roles. And spoiler alert, in both of these stories, they don't fit exactly the way that you're used to. So you'll have to explain that. You'll have to explain how these characters relate to the original fairy tales, the original gender roles, and immediately talk about how they present themselves as different. Then you'll go on to explain this. How and to what extent does the power shift? This is what happens during the story. I'm telling you, in both The Company of Wolves and The Tiger's Bride, we meet two characters, and through the events of the story, the power relationship between them shifts. In other words, it starts one way and it ends up a different way. So your job is to pay attention to that, describe it, explain it, and then talk about what's important about what the story does. So I hope that makes sense. Okay, so now I'm going to start talking about the paper format. And I want you to pay attention to this bold statement right here. It's really, really, really important that you not only read this assignment sheet carefully and try to understand it. If it was me, I would print it out and take notes all over it. It's really important that you read the example story, I Shall Do You Mischief in the Wood, which is a Red Riding Hood retelling. It's really important that you read that story and that you read my example essay and watch the videos associated with that. I'm going to talk through a bunch of stuff here, but all of these things together equal teaching. Okay, so there's going to be a refresher about essay organization. There's going to be a refresher about thesis statements. And you're going to have this assignment sheet basically gives you a model for a way to structure an essay. It's true that you have to follow it, but it gives you a good model. And then with the full essay I'm going to show you later, you'll have another model. So although your task isn't easy, I'm hoping that it'll be very clear what you need to do when you start to do it. Okay, so here's the structure your essay should follow. You're going to have headers, and you'll see how that works in the example paper. First header should be an introduction. Should do all these things. Introduce the story you choose, relate it to the original tale, set up the traditional gender role idea, and this can be very quick. And then it should have a two-part thesis. So I'm going to talk about thesis statements in different ways, but I want your thesis to always be a complex sentence with a semicolon or two sentences. The first half of the sentence should set things up. It should talk about how and to what extent the female's traditional gender role shifts. The next part should talk about the significance. I'll slow down and talk more about thesis statements in the example essay, and I can post more instruction about thesis statements. But what you need to know right now is you're probably not going to know this part exactly when you start writing. Like, you don't know what you're going to think completely about the story until you've thought about it more, until you've gotten through setting things up, until you set up the ways that the characters started, and then you start explaining the way that they change. So you should have a draft thesis statement in your first draft. You'll revise it on your own before the final draft, but just to get started, just put something down. So, and that's what this is going to be. Your thesis statement for this essay could be something like, Red in Angela Carter's The Company of Wolves thinks she knows everything. Although she's young and beautiful, she's more experienced than Red Riding Hood from the original tale. She learns by the end of the story that she is not as significant as she thinks, but she still gains some power in the end. Something like that. Notice I didn't talk about that significance piece just yet. Okay, so you'll notice all my videos are 15 minutes. On the one hand, I apologize for them being so long. On the other, I don't know how to make them shorter and say what I need to say. So I got about 5 minutes to get through the rest of this outline if I don't want to make another video. And of course, I just wasted that time saying this. So your next header is how you see your chosen female protagonist related to a traditional female gender role. This is basically setting up the start of the story in terms of gender roles. This is what you will have written about in your observation. This is what you practiced writing about in the Red Riding Hood observation. Then you do the same thing for the male, whether it's the wolf or the beast. Set up how they are related to gender roles. Then the real meat of your essay, probably half of your paper. So you've already written a little bit, you've already written a quarter of it, setting things up. The next section is how the action of the story leads to a shift in power. So here is where you'll go through the story and pick and choose your important moments and details, and you're explaining what you observe. Just like in the observation, you're explaining what you notice. I noticed that this moment seems important, related to gender roles. In this moment, this thing happens, and to me, that means this, right? So that'll be the longest part of your paper. Okay, so in this video, I have about 3 minutes left. I'm going to talk a little bit about how to write commentary. How do you interpret the end of the story? I write here, so your conclusion essentially is going to bring the focus outward from the story to some larger significance. And so this section I write here is where critical thinking comes in, and it's probably the most challenging part. The rest is a lot of work, but it's still making complex, detailed observations. This commentary is another beast, or wolf, if you will. So here are some things that you might think about, some questions you kind of might ask of the story to come up with like something to say in the conclusion. So you have a long, interesting, complex conclusion. So I tried to structure the research paper in a way that would encourage you to do that by asking, to what extent does power shift? That to what extent language asks you to make an evaluation. And so the way you might think about that is think of, to what extent is a scale with your characters with complete power on one side and complete lack of power on another. So here's the scale, utter lack of power over here, and absolute power over here. And here's a zero line. So where do you think your characters land in the beginning of the story? Red, in the company of wolves, she maybe has power of like 3 or something like that. She probably thinks she has power of 5, but let's say it's a 3. The wolf maybe has power of 8 or even 10. That's up to you to decide. I don't know. This is just an example. Well, throughout the story, that power shifts and it moves. So it's no spoiler to say that during the story, Red's power dips to 0 or maybe even below 0, and then she gains it back. And the wolf goes from having really high level of power and control and authority to less than that. So you might ask yourself, where are your female and male characters located at the beginning story? Where are they located at the end? And does where they end up reveal any problematic situations? If there's still a power disparity, what does that mean? What's important about that? Another way of thinking about this is, at the end of the story, even though there are some things resolved, are there any problematic elements remaining? Or you can think about real life. What does this story have to say about real life relations between genders and perhaps society? So we'll talk more about that and some of the work leading up to this essay that's due in about a week and a half, at least this summer, will help you think about those things. Here's some formatting stuff. Please check that out. Another important thing, turn in a complete draft. Do your absolute best when you turn it in. There will be possibility for revisions, but I really am going to need a complete essay. Thank you.